training, and you're first getting into service. And I'd like for you, if you would, to touch on instructors, some stories about your instructors if you have any, and what led you to choose the Army Air Corps, and could you talk about the draft, and then we'll move on to your missions, etc.
Okay. First about the draft, you had to be 21 years old in World War II before you were drafted. And I was not 20, I was 20 years old. So when they accepted me, they would not swear me in until I went home. They told me I had to go home and get my parents to sign a release so that I could go into service. And I told them, look, I've been married for 2 years, I've got a child, my parents are not responsible for me anymore. They said, oh, well, in that case, then your wife is going to have to sign for you. Now, my wife was 17 years old, and I'm 20, and she's going to have to sign for me to get in. And I thought that was hysterical, but we did it. That's the way they wanted it. So I got back in. I got in service because my wife signed me in. Now, one of the reasons that I chose the Air Force, of course, was because as a child, growing up, I read lots of magazines about World War I, and one of them that I especially loved was G8 and his Battle Aces. And it was all about a guy who was kind of a private eye, and at the same time he was flying airplanes for the United States Air Force, or Army Air Corps at that time. So I didn't like the idea of going out and digging holes in the mud, and laying in the cold and the water, and not having good food. And I thought, well, this is what I want to do. So that's why I chose the Army Air Corps. Also, I had some friends that were in it, and I guess you kind of follow what your friends do. And I had several friends that were actually had gone into the Army Air Corps. And you asked me about instructors. I didn't mention my instructors, as I was talking to you before. Some of them were not very pleasant things to happen. Some of them were funny. So let me start with primary. That was when I first started flying. My instructor was an older man, been flying for years. Always told me, don't fly like I do, fly like I tell you to do, which is good advice anytime. He was a very good instructor, and actually we went up and he showed me how to shoot landings. And
when was this?
This was in Chickasha, Oklahoma in the spring of 1943. And he took me out and flew around with me for a while, and I had about 6 hours, and we landed on an auxiliary landing field one day, and we did not have interphones on this airplane. We had what they called a Gosport, which was hollow tubes that ran up to your ear. You wore a helmet, and you had like little speakers in the helmet, but they didn't have any electric to them. They had these little hollow tubes, and they ran back, and he spoke into a little hollow tube. Like if you see anybody way back that couldn't hear, they have a horn. Well, that's kind of what he spoke into, and you could hear it. And he told me, he said, take me over to the middle of the field. And there was a little building over there, and I didn't know what he was going to do, so you don't ever question your instructor. So I taxied over there, and he climbed out of the airplane, pulled his parachute out of it, and fastened his seat belt, and climbed up there on the wing with me, and he said, okay, you go shoot some landings, I'm going to sit over here and watch. And I had never been in an airplane by myself, you know, and that's kind of scary. And so anyway, I taxied out, and I thought, boy, he sure trusts me. I don't know if I can do this or not. And I gave it the power, and started down the runway. And when it lifted into the air, I said, oh my goodness, he's not back there to help me. I got to do this by myself. But as it turned out, could always shoot landings, and I didn't have any problems at all. And as a result, he let me solo and do a lot of stuff on my own. But the one thing I remember about him was, and this is kind of a story on me, we finally got to where we could fly across country. And we were out in Oklahoma, and they had this route figured out that we would go along a river that went due west, and we would come to a town out there, and then we'd kind of angle, and we'd angle to another town, and then another angle, and we'd end up at a town where there was an airport, and we would land there, and then there was a railroad track went right straight back up to our base. So actually flying out the river and flying from this town up by watching the railroad was no problem. It was between the two places, and in between the two places was a artillery base that the Army used, and they had a whole lot of little small observation planes, Cubs actually, and they flew around and told the artillerymen where their shells were landing. And they told us, don't fly over that, that's dangerous. And actually it was forbidden to fly over it. Well, I went out the river fine, and I turned, and I don't know what happened. I ended up, it was Fort Sill, Oklahoma. I ended up flying right over Fort Sill, and I'm looking down and I see all these little airplanes flying everywhere, and the ground's blowing up, and I said, this is not a good place for me to be. So then I turned and I dived over and got away from them. By this time, I am totally lost. I have no idea where I am. And I see this little town, and I decide, well, you know, like Farmington, it's probably got a sign at the edge of town that tells you what the town is. So I flew down real low, which was, of course, completely against the rules. Flew along this highway. I never did see any sign. I saw a water tower, and I circled it, couldn't find any town. And I saw a high school or a school. I thought, well, that'll say Farmington High School or whatever the name of the town is. And I flew right down across the front of it, and it said Roosevelt High. That didn't help me a bit. And as I'm pulling up from that, I look out, and here comes another airplane. And this airplane has two people in it. Now, about every 10th airplane had an instructor that flew with whoever the student was, and he was to not do anything but just observe. And I knew he had observed me doing all these illegal things. So I climbed up, and he came up alongside of me, and of course I wanted to show him that I was lost. So I had this nice map, and there was no cover on the cockpit, it was wide open, and I wanted to pick the map up and show him that, like this, I'm lost. Instead of that, the wind sucked it right out of my hand, no. And it, just like I took my map and threw it away, and he shook his head, and he pointed me over on the other side. So I flew over there. Now, I had never flown formation before, but I thought this was fun, and it was probably my last flight because they're gonna wash me out. So I tucked it right in, and I flew real close formation with him, and we flew down, and we landed at the next place down there. I didn't wait for him. I taxied around and took off, flew back up to Chickasha. But by this time, I'm really worried, and so I waited until he landed, and now bear in mind these instructors were all civilians. They were not military instructors. These were all civilians from a flying school, and I'm sure that they got together at night and laughed over the crazy things that we students did. But when he finally landed, I went up and told him, I said, I didn't mean to throw that map away. I said, the wind pulled it right out of my hands. And he said, yeah, I've heard that. And never told me anything good or bad. So I thought, well, I'll be up for a check flight, and they're going to wash me out. The next day I went up, my instructor told me what to do, and I went and did it. The next day nothing happened. I thought, something's got to come of this. About the third day, my instructor walked up to me and said, Lewis, you owe me 75 cents. Of course, I paid him. I didn't know what it was for, but I gave him the 75 cents, and I said, what's that for? He said, that's for that map you threw away. So then I knew that my instructor had been told what had happened. So that was the end of the thing. Nothing ever happened about it. Then I got to basic.